So, Elaine, thank you so much for joining me. I would love if we can begin. If you could just maybe introduce yourself, share a little bit about yourself, what Beacon is, some of the things that you're working towards.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So Elaine Davidson from Beacon Lane Consulting. We are a boutique consulting firm. We work with clients in a bunch of different ways. We basically have three arms to our business. The first arm is a traditional consulting firm where we work with global clients, helping them to design and implement recruiting strategies. Those strategies help them hire talent better, smarter, and faster. So that's one part of our business. And that's really where Beacon Link started after I left my corporate run for 20 years, which we'll probably get into a little bit. The second arm is pretty straightforward. We do what's called retained search for HR. So we place HR professionals into our clients' organizations. And the third part is a little bit of a different arm, and it's through our career lounge, where we work with early career professionals and helping them land jobs faster and, really important, without the chaos.
That's awesome. And so, one, how did you identify the three pillars?
Yep.
And two, how did you even get into this work in the first place?
Yeah, good questions. Okay, so the pillars, let me start with the second question because that leads into the answer to the first. So I actually spent 20 years in corporate, working in global consulting firms and in a Wall Street environment, running global recruiting talent acquisition in different capacities. Really love the space. It's worth noting, especially for those early career folks out there, that that's not where I started. I actually started as an accountant. I don't normally share that, but I guess I'm sharing it with the world right now because I actually am a numbers person and I'm an operations person, but it just wasn't fueling me in the way that I wanted to be fueled. So while I was working at the company I was working at, which is the company I was hired into right out of college, so I think that's really important. I landed in a very good organization out of college and pivoted within that organization because while I liked the organization, I didn't like auditing. And so I went into HR and really grew my career from there. So I learned from the ground up. And then as I continued, growing in my career 20 years later, I realized that I really still loved what I did, but I wanted to do it in a little bit of a different way. And that's where the kind of entrepreneurial bug really kind of came out. And it was probably always in there. So when I left corporate, one of the things you learn when you leave a corporate environment is fastest path to cash. So for me, it was, okay, what do I already know? What am I really good at? And who do I know? And how can I go out there and just deliver that and be of service? So that was the first thing I did. I said, okay, I can consult and help clients implement recruitment strategies that are going to help them. And that's what I had done for the better part of 20 years. So that's how I started. And then organically, it grew into this piece around retained search because we were working with recruiting functions all the time. And I was a recruiter earlier in my career, and that kind of always stayed with me. The other arm, this arm around the career lounge, is probably the biggest passion point for me. So always throughout my career, I was helping people with their job search, writing their resume, found myself sitting in Starbucks with a lot of college grads. And I realized that what was happening was we were having the same conversation over and over. Same, here's how you write a resume, here's how you network, here's how you figure out your brand, and so on and so forth. And I realized that this is really a program, it's a curriculum. And so that is how I got into that space. And what we did with that experience and knowledge is we packaged it into a real curriculum. And it's called Pivot 12, which is why I actually like using the word pivot before, because it's a Pivot 12. Our Pivot 12 curriculum is really our employment curriculum, teaching early career professionals and really almost anybody who's seeking a job how to do that with a lot less noise and chaos.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing like the background and then how you got to where you're at. I would love to dive into that a little bit further in terms of how you transitioned from doing audit to HR, because I bet that a lot of things are going through your head. I would imagine that you were probably thinking to yourself, and I would imagine that some young professionals who were in their first job think to themselves like, oh geez, I don't like doing this type of work. I have to split and leave the company altogether. I bet a lot of them think that they assume that they don't realize that there's an opportunity within a different department that they could pursue. What was your mindset? How did you stumble across HR? How did you feel confident enough to know that this was an option for you?
Yeah, it's so good to think about that because I I knew that I was in a good organization. I was working, and I'll just share, I was working for PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. So I knew it was a great organization. I had worked very, very hard to get there. And so I said to myself, if I look around this organization, who is doing what I love? And every time I asked, I found myself volunteering all the time to help out in campus recruiting. And when I was doing that, I was happy and I felt like I could do it for days and days and not get bored or get tired of it. So I just continued to build, relationships in that space. I was still working as an accountant, but I continued to build relationships, volunteer my time, just get involved in any possible way that I could. And it was a little scary raising my hand for a position there because you're thinking, wow, now the people I work for are really going to know that I'm not happy. But I just knew that that was what I wanted to step into. And so I did it carefully. I built a lot of relationships. So I built a lot of trust. And then the mentoring piece came in, right? So I asked people to guide me and advise me on how do you do this? How do you make a move into something that you weren't hired for initially? And that's kind of, and I just kept doing that until I landed a job there.
Yeah. So a couple of questions from that.
Yeah.
One, do you have any suggestions for young professionals for how to tactfully accomplish that transition? Because one of the things you identified was like, oh, wow, everybody who's in my department now knows that I'm looking to switch jobs. I would imagine that there's a good way to go about doing that, and there's a bad way to go about doing that. Now, with your experience in recruitment and HR, I would imagine that you've got a pretty good insight as to a story of what not a good transition looks like and what a great transition looks like. What suggestions do you have on that?
Yeah. So the first thing is, and this is so important, you've got to be really good at the job you're in. You've got to show up. You've got to do the work. You've got to be present. So even if you don't love it and you know there's something else you want, there's nobody who's going to refer you into another department if you haven't done a really good job where you already are. So what I always tell candidates, especially earlier in their career, when you're interviewing or working, but typically when you're interviewing, you're actually not really interviewing for that first job. You're interviewing for the second or third job, right? It's always a building block. You start somewhere because where is it going to get you next or next, especially early in your career where you know you're going to grow and evolve. So you have to be exceptional in the job that you're in. You have to build a network, and there's a differentiator. You need a mentor, and you also need what I often refer to and hear referred to as a sponsor. So two different things. Someone who is a mentor might be a little bit closer to you in their career trajectory. I'm not saying they're a peer, but there's someone who's maybe a level or two above you. Whereas a sponsor is someone who's got real authority in the organization and takes you under their wing and advocates for you. So having both of those, and I did have both of those, and I worked hard to get that, but having that is really important. And there's also a part that you have to really be able to know yourself and know what's your non-negotiable. And you can have a non-negotiable at any point in your career. It's not only for those who are the most senior, but you have to know what your non-negotiable is. What are you willing to do? How long will you stay at this company? I actually was pretty unhappy doing the work I was doing. Sunday nights would come and I would get those like Sunday night blues. And I figured, how long can I keep doing this where I know I'm in the wrong place? I'm not doing what I want to do. So I had to really figure out for myself, how long can I do this? And work that out in my head. And then kind of go from there. And I knew I wanted to move into HR. I knew I wanted to move at the time into campus recruiting. And so I just kept showing up. And I actually went to graduate school and started taking courses in organizational psychology. Like just everything I could do to better myself is what I did.
That's awesome. And so that's very interesting. So you talk about sponsors and you talk about mentors and the difference between those two. I think that's a huge point that you just alluded to. Did you find your sponsor? Or did your sponsor find you? How do you go about building that relationship? Did your mentor, because it seems like the way you describe it, mentor is someone that's a little more closer to you, whereas the sponsor is maybe a little more distant, but they know you well enough that they're going to vouch for you. How do you bridge that gap? How do you make those relationships happen?
Yeah, that is completely accurate. And the sponsor one's a little scarier at any point because they're usually a little bit more senior than what you're normally used to kind of working with and sitting across the table with, right? So I was fortunate at certain points in my career where it was like the company policy where everybody would have this. But that's where I learned about it. But then there were also times where you had to just kind of figure out where was the right chemistry and who was that person. And actually what I would do is I would go to that person, I would schedule a time with them, I would work through usually their executive assistant, and I would get time on their calendar. And I actually would go to them and ask them if they would play this role in my career growth. And people actually find that very flattering when you actually go to them and say, you're somebody I admire, you're somebody that I think can really teach me a lot. And is this something that we can maybe do on an informal basis or formal, whatever it is? Maybe we go for coffee once a month and I do a check-in with you once a month outside of that. So just, ask. You have to be able to advocate for yourself and ask. And that's something that, we teach a lot to candidates, is advocating for yourself always, because nobody's going to do that better for you than you. So I'm not saying not to be afraid, because it is a little scary, right? To go out to someone who, you think is, really senior to you, and it's a little bit intimidating. I don't ever tell people don't be afraid. My philosophy is be afraid and do it anyway. And so I think that's really important.
I love that. That's a really good perspective. It kind of follows the like ready, fire, aim mentality of like, you
Yes.
should have that respect for the person that you're meeting with. Like, you shouldn't come in nonchalant and just, acting like as if this is like casual hour. But at the same time, you shouldn't be so scared to have this conversation that you don't even put yourself out there.
Correct.
So I
Exactly.
love that middle ground that you described, because I think like you could see some people that see that and hear that and are like, oh wow, I'm just gonna like come into this person's office, kick my feet up on their desk, and just act like we're cool,
Not
but
gonna
it's not.
work.
But here's another really interesting thing, and this is something that I've learned from a few other young professionals who are in their career, and the importance of having that sponsor is, a lot of times I feel like a lot of people, young professionals, don't realize that they control who their sponsor is. Because I feel like that person you hook your horns to is a crucial person in your life, because his or her success and trajectory will be very much correlated to yours. I've seen frequently where you get that one manager who gets promoted to the next level, they bring everybody in their like gene pool up with them. And so yeah, I feel like there are a lot of people that are like, oh, my sponsor, I don't know if I like that person. I don't know if we have the greatest of rapports, and I don't necessarily know if I want to hook myself to that person. I guess my question is, how do you control who your sponsor is, and how do you kind of recognize when that's on or not on the right path?
Yeah, so I think there's two things here. One is sometimes you are assigned a sponsor, and there's no harm in that, right? It may not be the perfect sponsor for you, but if it's an assignment and this is company protocol, sometimes I think it's important to build relationships that are a little bit outside of your comfort zone, because that's reality, right? We have to kind of figure out how to navigate that. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think you should go and find a sponsor that also aligns a little bit more with your views, or kind of somebody who you look at and you can say, hey, I see myself in that seat 10 years from now, or I really want to model some of what I see in that person. So I think that sometimes it's important, and it's so difficult to put yourself in the company of somebody in the organization that you just feel really stressed by or uncomfortable. And I'm not saying that that's the place to kind of say, okay, I have to be here and this is the only person who could be my sponsor, but there are lessons to be learned, right? It could even be a lesson to be learned that that's what I don't want to be, right? That's the kind of leader I don't ever want to be. And that's something to be said for that. But I think it's really important, again, advocate for yourself, find that person that you look at and say, he or she is just outside my comfort zone, and I admire them so much that I'm going to go for it. I'm going to get that that appointment with them, and I'm going to ask them to play this role in my career growth. So I think it's important, both sides, always to kind of surround yourself even by people who maybe are not the obvious fit for you on paper. There's a lot to be said for that.
I love how you put it as the people, who are the people that you admire, and how can you go about emulating them? Because I think as humans, we strive to be like those who are like us, or who we would like to be like. And I think that's so great, because I think so often we will sell ourselves short. And I think, as they say, like, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Oh, yeah.
So my thought is, if you can spend more time with people that are doing the things or acting the way that you like to be acting, you will become more like them, almost just because you're around them.
That's true. I would say the one thing that I'm reflecting now, right, where I am in my career now, looking back, what I would have maybe done differently if I was then who I am now, is that I would have probably appreciated more the bits and pieces of different people that seemed like something that I wanted to emulate, right? So just because maybe, obviously I'm a female, and I have 3 kids, and so at one point my sponsor was a man who had no children, and at one point I probably thought that won't work for me, and that's a mistake actually. There's a lot to be learned, and you don't have to have someone who just looks like you, thinks like you, shows up the way you do. I actually think that could be very dangerous. I think there are things to take from different people who have been successful and figure out which pieces of those, when you put them together, are the puzzle that make you whole in your professional growth.
Yeah, I love it. That perspective of one, don't ever have just one mentor, have multiple perspectives that come at
Yes.
you to give you insight. Um, so here's something that I've observed in terms of mentorship is that there are some lessons that mentors can really help you take a big leap with because they've been there and done that before. But there are some lessons you just have to learn yourself. Even like someone can tell you a million times, this is the way that it's going to go. You're like, I still need to I need to fail a little bit. I need to touch the edge just to know that it's okay. You told me the edge was there, but I just wanted to look over that cliff just to make sure.
Yep.
I would love to learn from your perspective. What was a lesson that a mentor told you that really helped you take a big skip? And then what was a lesson that you had to learn on your own that you're like, I know that you've told me this, but I need to experience it myself to actually believe it?
Okay. So I think that for me, I was told at one point that I had to let people get to know me more in the organization. And this person did it in a way that was, so she was right. But where the fork in the road came was that it was the way in which she did it, which was very different than how my authentic self. So I build relationships differently than you build relationships, or this person who's sitting next to me. And so she was right that I needed to build. And I thought, well, of course I'm building relationships. I'm here every day, right? I guess, that's what I'm here for. I'm talking to people. I'm working with people. No, I really needed to build and make it, like, put it in my calendar, right? Like that's the kind of company this was, where sitting in front of somebody face to face and having a cup of coffee or something like that, or having lunch, was very important. It was valued. And to me, at the time, it seemed a little old school. Um, but she was right. It was valued. For me, it wasn't going out after work for cocktails. I wanted to get home. I had kids, that sort of thing. So I needed to figure out how it would work for me. Another thing that I've learned was, we had a lot of meetings in big boardrooms, big scary boardrooms, right? And I'm not somebody who speaks just to speak. And I know that I was told that people want to hear what you have to say, and I'm really comfortable sharing what I have to say when I have something to offer. And what I actually learned was that I was right in saying and thinking about, this is how I show up at work. This is how I show up in the world. I'm somebody who needs to process. My best ideas come when I've been able to walk away from a discussion, process it, and then come back to the table, maybe a day later, maybe a week later, maybe 2 hours later. I'm not sure, depends on what we're talking about, but really time to process. And a lot of times, I worked in very type A environments where everybody was talking and there was a lot of ideas at the table. And I often would kind of just sit back and observe and take it in. And that's just my natural state. And that's actually where everybody has a unique brilliance and their own genius. That's where mine would come out. And that's how mine would manifest. I needed to kind of go away and think about it and then come back. And I was right about that, because oftentimes at the end they'd say, wow, like the product was fantastic, but it really wasn't off the cuff at the table. Here's what we're going to do. And so that was just my way of, and what I learned in that was being able to say to people, I'm going to need time to process this. So can we come back in X amount of time? And as long as I was able to say that, it was okay. But I had to learn that on my own.
That's a really good lesson. I think that's a really good perspective. I think a lot of people, if they were in a scenario like that, would feel pressure to come up with an answer right then on the spot, not realizing that asking for time is an option and something that they can take advantage of. So I think that's a really good perspective.
Thank you.
So when you transitioned into starting Beacon, what I mean, I know that you, I mean, and this is what you hear this a lot from a lot of entrepreneurs who started in corporate and then went on and started their own companies, was their thought process. Well, I figured I would do it my own. I do it myself. And I love that you said like the fastest path to cash. What did you have mentors that helped guide you into starting your business and help building and growing it? And how did they, what
Big
advice did they give
time.
you?
Like big time. Right. I came out of 20 years of corporate. I worked for great companies. I was educated and then some. Figured I got this. No. So what I did was in my last year in my corporate job, I enrolled in a program for entrepreneurs. It was a full year program, had nothing to do with my work life. So I went off, to this other program in my spare time. And I felt like I had entered into a foreign land. I was sitting in this room of all these entrepreneurs, and they were like amazing, first of all, incredibly brilliant, smart people, but also very emotionally, spiritually available, really just kind of sharing. And I really felt at first like I was coming out of this world and I was stepping into this world, and I thought I don't belong and I'm like the odd man out. I'm so corporate. And what I realized there was like, these are my people and I want to be here. And I need to lean into this, as uncomfortable as it is for me, because it was really uncomfortable because I was still in my corporate life. I felt like I was living like this double identity kind of thing, right? I thought I was going to get found out. But it was a full year and it was incredible. I also invested early on when I was still in corporate in another program. I flew out to Arizona and I'm like, wow, is this really how people live? Is this what entrepreneurs do? And since then, I've never stopped investing in myself. It's not always easy to make that decision because you're always thinking, well, I can do this. There's, webinars and this, that, the other thing. That community has saved me and like raised me up so much more than I ever could have done on my own. Like I'm in a program right now. I'm in a full year program right now. I joined it in end of December, January. I'll be in it for the full year, and I will not close the year out without renewing somewhere in another program for sure, whether it's this program or another one. I just think that's so important.
That's amazing. So my next question is, what was your biggest failure when transitioning? Like, what was the biggest like face plant where you're like, oh, that didn't work out the way I wanted it to?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to share with you that I actually left corporate in 2011, the first time to start my own business. Didn't work. I ended up back in corporate.
Really? How did that happen?
That was my biggest face plant. I left and I didn't have much of a plan. I found I think my biggest failure there and lesson learned was I found other people who were trying to do the same thing I was doing and like hopped into this onto this journey with them thinking we were going to build something. And I think to this day, I'm not really sure why I did that. It must've been fear, right? Like just do something with a group of people and it'll be less scary, rather than going out on your own and having your own brand and all these things, right? That are about you and you're exposing yourself. So that was really scary, because it didn't work. We went out and I found myself working with other people and they wanted to call the shots and this one wanted to do this. And I was having to go places I didn't want to go. And I was borrowing money out of my savings to do this. It was just everything I didn't want it to be. And it was just a big failure. And I found myself back in a corporate job. Like within a year, I found myself back in corporate. And I'm really glad I did because my network grew exponentially. Because when I left, I had been 16 years at one company. So now it was like going back out and starting over again. I went to 2 more companies after that. And because of that, my network grew tremendously. I grew tremendously. And then when it was time to leave my last corporate job, I knew. Like I really knew what needed to happen and that the only mantra I had was whatever it takes. I will not go back. I'm going to do whatever it takes not because I think corporate's bad. I actually don't. I think it's fantastic for people who are wired for that. I just knew that I had work to do in the world that I couldn't do while working in another organization.
I love it. I think, what is the adage? If you're going to take the island, burn the ships.
Yes.
No retreat. There's no plan B. There's no safety net. And I think if you have that belief, you're right. You're going to achieve success.
Yep.
So Elaine, one question that I wanted to ask you as we're getting closer to the end here is, what is next for you? What is something that you're working towards next? with Beacon Consulting, or just in general?
Yeah, I'm super excited about where we are, like really super excited. So we when I first left my corporate life and built this business, it was very high-end consulting, meaning corporations would hire us to come in and do these big consulting projects. We still do them, but now we're also creating programs. So we're uh, programmatizing, if that's even a thing, right? Or productizing our offering. So we've got two big things coming out. One of them is in the consulting space, we are offering a program soon, the Recruiting Excellence Academy, where people can learn our methodology and then go take it back to their organizations. So it's a 6-month program, and you get curriculum and you get coaching and lots of other things. And then the other one is in the Career Lounge. We also are taking that to another level, where we are putting that on a learning platform right now, so that historically you had to be inside one of the organizations that we partner with to receive the program and to participate in it. But now we're actually going out and we are going to make it available direct to consumer as well. So that will be on a learning platform, partnering with universities, more nonprofits in the career readiness space, and just getting more early career professionals hired, just getting them hired faster, and again, without all that chaos.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. And then my last question is, what advice, if you any that you have, what would be your biggest piece of advice for any college student out there or young professional that's hearing this message, that's hearing what you're working on? What advice do you have for them?
Yeah. Okay. So we'll leave you with 3 things. Okay. So the first one is, and people may have heard this term before, but it's lead from where you are. I think that too often, especially for college students and early career professionals, we wait for this invitation to be a leader, right? For some title, some level, or some age perhaps. And that's not true. You just have to lead right from where you are, and have a voice, right? Just have a voice and lead right from where, whether you are in college, in an internship, whatever it may be, you have something to offer. The second point is that clarity attracts. This is really important if you're a college student right now and you're going to go out into the market for a job at some point soon. The clearer you are on what it is you want to do, the easier it will be for you to get hired. People think that companies want to hire someone who just comes in and says, I'll do anything. Not necessarily true. You have to have some level of clarity. And then, of course, you have to be agile and be willing to do different things. But clarity attracts. Do not be afraid to have some sort of an idea of what it is you want to do. And then the third one is network. Just keep networking and ask people to mentor you, to sponsor you, and don't assume that they're going to know exactly what you need. Give them bullet points on who you are. If you're networking and you're asking someone to help introduce you somewhere, give them as much knowledge and information about you to help them do that. That's so important. So again, lead from where you are, have that clarity. It's very attractive, and network. Just network.
I love it. Elaine, thank you so much for joining on this video podcast. I'm really grateful.